In the grand palace, where golden chandeliers hung like captured stars and the walls echoed with whispers of power and influence, the queen held her court with a grace and authority that commanded attention. She was a woman of remarkable presence, her beauty refined by years of careful grooming, her intelligence sharp enough to navigate the complex intrigues of the palace, and her influence over the nobles formidable. Yet, beneath her composed exterior, a storm of envy brewed. It was not power she feared losing, nor the loyalty of her ministers, but the subtle, radiant presence of another, a young woman whose beauty, intelligence, and natural favor among the court had begun to eclipse her own. The protagonist was a figure of quiet strength and undeniable charm. She moved through the palace with a serenity that drew the eyes of both nobles and servants, not through showy gestures, but through an innate grace and dignity. Her face was fair and radiant, her eyes bright with intelligence, and her voice carried a clarity and warmth that inspired trust. Unlike the queen, whose authority was established and demanded, the protagonist's influence was effortless, a natural admiration that required no coercion. The courtiers, impressed by her wisdom and demeanor, often sought her counsel, and even the king would occasionally show her a glance of respect that did not go unnoticed. The queen observed these interactions with a growing sense of discomfort. Every whispered compliment directed toward the protagonist, every subtle acknowledgement of her insight, felt like a challenge to the queen's own status. She began to notice the way the courtiers lingered near the girl, the way the servants instinctively deferred to her, and the casual yet undeniable admiration in the king's eyes. What began as mild irritation soon festered into something more potent, a fierce, consuming envy that gnawed at her composure. Each day, as she watched the protagonist move gracefully through the halls, the queen felt a tightening in her chest, a sense that her own authority was being quietly undermined by a mere presence of elegance and virtue. The queen's envy was multifaceted. She envied the protagonist's beauty, which seemed effortless compared to her own meticulously maintained appearance. She envied her intelligence, which shone naturally in conversation, effortlessly captivating those around her. She even envied the protagonist's reputation for fairness and wisdom, qualities that drew the king's attention in ways the queen could not command. The young woman was not competing overtly, she did not flaunt her influence or attempt to assert dominance. Yet, the queen perceived every act of quiet grace as a slight, every compliment from the court as a challenge to her supremacy. The more the protagonist flourished, the more the queen's envy hardened into a desire to remove or replace her. The queen began to formulate thoughts of replacement in the quiet recesses of her mind. She envisioned a palace where the protagonist's presence would be diminished, where her own beauty, intelligence, and authority would remain unchallenged. Every smile the protagonist received from the courtiers became a spark in the queen's imagination of schemes and strategies. She considered subtle manipulations, ways to discredit or distract, but each time the thought arose, the young woman's serene composure and growing favor reminded her that simple cruelty would not suffice. The protagonist was admired not merely for her appearance, but for her wisdom and integrity, a combination that made direct confrontation risky. Jealousy, the queen realized, required more than overt action. It demanded cunning, timing, and discretion. She began observing the protagonist closely, noting habits, routines, and moments when she was alone or vulnerable. Every conversation she overheard, every interaction she witnessed, became fodder for potential plots. The palace, normally a place of routine and decorum, became a stage for mental chess, with the queen attempting to anticipate the protagonist's movements, her influence, and the subtle admiration she inspired. The young woman, so unaware of the depth of envy she provoked, moved freely through her days, never suspecting that every glance, every gesture, had been noted and calculated against her by someone whose power was considerable and whose motives were dangerous. Yet, for all her envy, the queen could not ignore the admiration her subject inspired. There was a grudging recognition that the protagonist's virtues were genuine, that her beauty was unfeigned, and that her intelligence and fairness were innate qualities rather than cultivated artifices. This acknowledgement only made the queen's envy more acute, for it highlighted her own limitations. She could command, control, and strategize, but she could not naturally embody the effortless grace and virtuous aura that drew attention and loyalty. The queen's desire to replace her rival grew, fueled not only by jealousy but by fear of being overshadowed, by the knowledge that the court might one day see the young woman as more worthy of honor, attention, or even affection. In private chambers, the queen would pace, plotting subtle ways to undermine the protagonist without exposing her own malice. She considered whispering rumors, arranging minor inconveniences, or creating situations that would force the young woman into mistakes. Each plan, however, was tempered by the awareness that the protagonist's reputation was solid, her patience and wisdom unwavering. The queen's envy, while intense, was matched by a careful deliberation that kept her schemes hidden and her intentions masked from all but herself. The tension between them was now palpable, though the young woman remained unaware of the storm brewing behind the queen's composed exterior. The envy that had started as quiet discomfort had grown into a consuming desire for replacement, a determination to see the protagonist's influence diminished and her own authority restored to uncontested prominence. The palace, bathed in sunlight and adorned with gilded beauty, hid beneath its splendor the seeds of rivalry and the dangerous interplay of admiration, envy, and ambition. Though the queen's schemes unfolded around her, the protagonist remained composed and observant, aware that subtle currents of malice often accompanied the polished surfaces of palace life. She did not act impulsively, nor did she confront the queen openly. Instead, she relied on careful attention and measured caution. Every interaction, every glance, and every whispered conversation was noted with quiet precision, as if she were piecing together a delicate puzzle that would reveal the queen's intentions without forcing a confrontation prematurely. Her awareness grew steadily, a skill honed through years of navigating the nuances of court life and human behavior. At first, the signs were nearly imperceptible. A lingering glance from the queen that held a hint of disapproval, a suggestion from a noble that carried hidden insinuation, a subtle rearrangement of seating during ceremonies, all these small actions hinted at an underlying resentment. The protagonist observed these with patience, noting patterns rather than reacting immediately. She understood that malice often revealed itself through repetition, that consistent behavior rather than isolated incidents betrayed true intent. Her keen perception allowed her to sense the queen's envy, even when it was carefully masked behind courtesy or regal poise. The protagonist also recognized the subtle manipulations of the court. Courtiers who once sought her advice occasionally hesitated, influenced by the queen's whispered suggestions or insinuations. Invitations to gatherings were occasionally delayed, and tasks were occasionally altered in ways that seemed insignificant but hinted at deliberate interference. Yet, the protagonist approached these anomalies with measured calm. She did not allow frustration, anger, or fear to cloud her judgment, understanding that reacting hastily could play into the queen's schemes and compromise her own position. Instead, she catalogued each incident, discerning patterns, motives, and possible outcomes. Even as the queen's magical attempts subtly influenced her surroundings, the protagonist remained aware without overtly acknowledging the supernatural forces at play. Strange shifts in air currents, unexpected disturbances of letters or documents, and other subtle signs hinted at intervention beyond ordinary human perception. She treated these occurrences with a balanced curiosity, aware that some forces in the palace might act in favor of fairness and justice, guiding events in ways that were not immediately visible. Her calm observation and mental acuity allowed her to navigate both human malice and the unseen influences that swirled around the court. In her private moments, the protagonist reflected on the queen's actions, weighing each subtle offense against the greater context of palace life. She considered the motivations behind every whisper, every strategic delay, and every arranged encounter, discerning that these were not random occurrences but carefully orchestrated attempts to displace her influence. She recognized that the queen's envy was not born of whim alone, but of a calculated desire to see her removed or replaced. Yet, rather than panic or anger, she responded with patience, understanding that the revelation of malice required careful observation, restraint, and strategic awareness. Her awareness also extended to her own conduct. She maintained a demeanor that was calm, composed, and beyond reproach, understanding that any sign of agitation could be exploited. Her conversations were measured, her movements graceful, and her interactions polite and respectful, reinforcing her image as virtuous and trustworthy. By observing without confrontation, she protected herself from the queen's schemes while ensuring that her integrity remained unquestioned. This restraint was not born of fear but of wisdom. She knew that patience in the face of hidden malice was often the strongest form of defense. The protagonist also quietly monitored allies and acquaintances within the court. She discerned who might be susceptible to the queen's influence, who could serve as unwitting agents in the queen's schemes, and who remained genuinely loyal. By noting these distinctions, she prepared herself to respond effectively when the time came to address the queen's malice, ensuring that her actions would be guided by knowledge rather than reaction. Her awareness was holistic, encompassing both the direct actions of the queen and the broader network of influence she sought to manipulate. Even amidst the subtle manipulations and occasional magical disturbances, the protagonist maintained her poise. She allowed herself to observe, reflect, and prepare, understanding that premature action could worsen the situation. Her awareness became a quiet power, enabling her to navigate the palace's complex dynamics with clarity and composure. She understood that malice often overreaches, that schemes built on envy tend to unravel when met with patience, and that the timing of response could determine the ultimate outcome. In essence, the protagonist's awareness was both shield and strategy. She sensed the queen's malice in every nuanced detail, observed without confrontation, and prepared for the eventual revelation of truth. By balancing vigilance with composure, she protected her position, preserved her dignity, and ensured that any confrontation would occur on her terms, guided by justice rather than impulsive reaction. The palace, a place of grandeur and intrigue, became a stage upon which she exercised quiet intelligence, letting patience and observation form the foundation of her eventual vindication. In the palace, beyond the opulent halls and the glittering chambers, there existed a corridor of ancient mirrors, tall, ornate, and polished to a reflective sheen that seemed to shimmer with an almost otherworldly light. These mirrors were no ordinary glass. They were said to have been enchanted centuries ago by a wise court sorcerer, a guardian of truth and justice within the palace. Legend spoke of their ability to reveal hidden motives, expose deceit, and forewarn of consequences that the eye alone could not see. Few dared approach them casually, for the mirrors demanded respect, and their revelations were often unsettling. Yet, the protagonist had long felt their quiet presence, sensing that they were silent witnesses to the currents of power and envy that flowed through the royal household. The queen, absorbed in her schemes and confident in her authority, paid little heed to the whispered tales of the mirror's power. Her focus was fixed on replacing the protagonist, on undermining her influence, and on ensuring that envy transformed into action that would tilt the court in her favor. Yet, as she enacted subtle manipulations, whispered suggestions, and minor deceptions, the mirrors began to respond. At first, the changes were nearly imperceptible, a shadow that seemed to shift unnaturally in reflection, a brief flicker of an image that did not correspond to reality. But the protagonist, attentive to the palace's nuances and the unseen forces that surrounded her, noticed these signs, interpreting them as warnings of the mirror's growing awareness of the queen's malice. The mirror's revelations were subtle yet powerful. Whenever the queen plotted overtly against the protagonist, whether through orchestrated misunderstandings, magical attempts, or public embarrassment, the mirrors reflected distorted images of the queen herself. In these reflections, her face would sometimes appear twisted with fear or anguish, or her gestures would be shown as leading to consequences far graver than she anticipated. Objects in the mirror's reflections sometimes appeared broken or overturned, foreshadowing the unraveling of her plans. The palace servants and courtiers, unaware of the mirror's true nature, often dismissed these as tricks of light or imagination, but for the protagonist, the messages were unmistakable. Each time the queen attempted to exert her influence, the mirrors seemed to act in subtle retaliation. A whispered lie meant to sully the protagonist's reputation would appear in the mirror with the queen caught in compromising or alarming positions. A magical charm designed to unsettle the young woman might be reflected as backfiring, showing the queen's own peril. The mirrors became an unspoken ally to the protagonist, revealing the hidden consequences of malicious intent before any harm could be done. Though the queen remained oblivious, her schemes were quietly documented in the shifting reflections, each image a warning of the justice that awaited her should she continue. The protagonist, observing these subtle cues, felt a growing sense of reassurance. The mirrors, it seemed, were aligned with the forces of fairness and truth, ensuring that malice would not succeed unchecked. She did not need to confront the queen directly or act impulsively. The warnings of the mirrors allowed her to anticipate potential threats and navigate the court's intrigues with strategic patience. Each glimpse of the mirror's warnings strengthened her awareness, helping her understand the stakes of the queen's envy and the possible outcomes of the unfolding plots. Meanwhile, the queen's actions increasingly triggered these supernatural responses. Minor manipulations that she considered clever and inconspicuous were met with immediate reflection in the mirrors, displaying subtle yet unmistakable consequences. A misrepresented message would appear in the mirrors with the queen caught in a moment of embarrassment. An attempt to sway a courtier would reflect her posture faltering, her expression one of apprehension. The repeated appearances of these warnings, though invisible to most, began to disturb the queen in ways she could not consciously articulate. She felt, deep down, an unease whenever she enacted her schemes, sensing that the unseen forces of the palace were vigilant and unforgiving. The mirrors also began to act as silent communicators to the protagonist. She learned to interpret the image's nuances, understanding which of the queen's plots were immediate threats and which were likely to fail. The mirror's reflections, often surreal in their depiction, provided guidance without explicit instruction. They revealed the queen's intentions, highlighted the consequences of malice, and demonstrated that actions born of envy were always visible to forces beyond human perception. Through these warnings, the protagonist gained a subtle but crucial advantage: knowledge of intent before harm could befall her. As days turned into weeks, the mirror's warnings became increasingly dramatic. The queen's attempts to manipulate or replace the protagonist were consistently mirrored with images of her own downfall. Courtiers who might have been subtly swayed by the queen's malice noticed her growing agitation, her hesitation, and the faint glances she cast toward the corridor of mirrors. Even without understanding the magic at play, the tension was evident, and the palace itself seemed to respond to the unseen justice manifested in the reflections. Through the mirrors, the palace taught a lesson of its own. Deceit, envy, and cruelty were visible to forces beyond ordinary sight, and the consequences of such intentions could not be hidden. The protagonist, aware yet patient, allowed these warnings to guide her actions, maintaining her dignity and composure while observing the queen's growing frustration. The mirrors, in their silent and mystical way, had become a shield and a guide, revealing truth and consequence in a manner both subtle and unyielding, ensuring that the queen's envy could never achieve its full intent. The queen's determination to remove the protagonist grew more intense with each passing day, yet her efforts repeatedly met with failure. Every scheme she devised, no matter how clever or carefully orchestrated, seemed to unravel before it could take effect. What frustrated her most was not the protagonist's skill alone, but the silent, mystical intervention of the mirrors that reflected her malice and hinted at the peril awaiting her. Each reflection served as a warning, revealing the consequences of her envy and casting a shadow over her plans. The queen's confidence began to falter, replaced with a creeping unease that gnawed at her composure. One of her earliest schemes involved attempting to isolate the protagonist from the court's favor. She orchestrated subtle rumors, suggesting that the young woman sought to manipulate the king or that her influence over court affairs was growing dangerously unchecked. Courtiers were nudged, in whispers and hints, to question the protagonist's loyalty. Yet, as these attempts were set into motion, the mirrors intervened. They reflected images of the queen herself, entangled in webs of suspicion and disfavor, her gestures clumsy, her expression fearful. Courtiers, observing her visible agitation and unusual behavior, became hesitant to follow her lead. Instead, they found themselves drawn toward the calm assurance and dignity of the protagonist, reinforcing her growing prominence rather than diminishing it. The queen next attempted to create misunderstandings in the protagonist's communications. Letters were intercepted and altered, instructions subtly modified, and tasks rearranged to appear as failures on the protagonist's part. However, each alteration, when brought into the protagonist's awareness, was mirrored with vivid images of the queen facing humiliation, public exposure, or even injury. In these reflections, she saw herself caught in situations where her deception backfired, and the anticipated triumph over the protagonist transformed into scenes of personal peril. The queen's confidence faltered further, but her envy would not allow her to cease her efforts, compelling her to pursue ever more intricate schemes. Magical interventions were not spared from failure. The queen consulted sorcerers to cast spells intended to undermine the young woman's influence. Charms designed to bring discord, illusions to discredit her reputation, and subtle hexes to weaken her presence were all attempted. Yet the mirrors, in their mystical clarity, revealed the consequences of these acts. Each spell was reflected in visions of the queen's own suffering, moments of public embarrassment, minor accidents, and even apparitions of danger that mirrored her envy and ambition. The queen began to recognize a pattern. The more she acted against the protagonist, the more vividly the mirrors portrayed her own doom. Her magical schemes, intended to harm the young woman, instead served to illuminate her own vulnerability. The queen's attempts to manipulate relationships within the court were equally unsuccessful. She tried to pit allies of the protagonist against her, subtly suggesting disloyalty or inciting minor conflicts that might discredit the girl. Each time, the mirrors responded with visions of the queen herself caught in betrayals, misunderstandings, or precarious situations. Courtiers, unconsciously sensitive to the queen's growing anxiety and the tension in her demeanor, were less inclined to follow her manipulations. The protagonist's allies remained steadfast, guided perhaps by the unspoken force reflected in the mirrors, their loyalty unaffected by the queen's scheming. Public humiliation became another avenue of attempted replacement. The queen sought to arrange events where the protagonist would appear incompetent or awkward in front of nobles or visiting dignitaries. She controlled introductions, seating arrangements, and the flow of ceremonies to highlight perceived flaws or mistakes. Yet, every time the young woman stepped into a situation crafted for her downfall, the mirrors reflected the queen in moments of peril, disgrace, or unforeseen consequence. Each misstep in the queen's orchestration, amplified by the mirror's revelations, served to protect the protagonist and subtly guide the court's attention toward her grace and composure rather than the queen's intended humiliation. Even attempts at direct confrontation failed spectacularly. The queen, frustrated by the repeated ineffectiveness of her subtle manipulations, considered openly challenging the young woman's influence. The mirrors, however, revealed the danger of such actions before they could occur. Scenes of confrontation were reflected as disastrous for the queen, showing her exposed, vulnerable, or facing consequences far beyond her expectations. The young woman's calm, aware presence only magnified the reflections, making clear that malice could not succeed against virtue protected by unseen forces. Over time, the queen began to feel trapped within the palace she once commanded with ease. Each scheme, whether minor or elaborate, reflected back images of her own failure, danger, or humiliation. The protagonist's steady patience, intelligence, and moral fortitude remained intact, and the mirrors ensured that every act of envy was met with a clear warning. The queen's frustration turned to fear, the envy that had driven her once proud confidence now shadowed by the repeated visualization of her own doom. Though she continued to plot, every attempt served only to highlight the futility of her efforts. The mirrors, silent witnesses to her malice, had become both judge and guide, ensuring that every malicious act reflected its consequences. The protagonist, observing with patience and composure, remained untouched, her virtue reinforced and her status unshaken. The queen's failures, mirrored for all unseen eyes, served as a growing testament to the power of justice, patience, and integrity within the palace, a force she could neither control nor escape. The queen, once confident in her authority and the certainty of her schemes, now found herself gripped by a growing, insidious fear. The mirrors, ancient and unyielding, reflected more than mere appearances. They revealed outcomes, consequences, and fates that seemed tied to her envy. Each time she attempted to maneuver against the protagonist, the mirrors displayed disturbing visions. Her own demise, her reputation in ruins, or accidents that would strip her of influence and power. No subtlety, no magic, no manipulation could escape their watchful gaze. The realization that these forces were beyond her control unsettled her deeply, filling the once proud ruler with a creeping dread that was impossible to shake. At first, she tried to rationalize the visions, convincing herself that the mirrors were exaggerating, that they were mere superstitions meant to frighten the foolish. Yet, every attempt she made to manipulate events backfired, reinforcing the accuracy of the mirrors' warnings. Tasks that she orchestrated to humiliate the protagonist were thwarted. Plans to sway the court failed as courtiers noticed her agitation or inexplicable missteps. The queen's confidence, once unshakable, began to crumble. She paced the corridors at night, glancing nervously toward the line of mirrors, as if expecting them to leap from their frames and confront her directly. Her thoughts spiraled with the fear of public disgrace, of magical retribution, and most chillingly, of the literal death she had glimpsed reflected in those polished surfaces. The panic manifested in every facet of her behavior. Her hands trembled when she wrote instructions meant to sabotage the protagonist. Her voice, once firm and commanding, wavered in front of courtiers. In meetings, she hesitated, overthinking every word, every gesture, fearful that the mirrors had already shown the repercussions of her actions. Even her closest advisors noticed a change in demeanor, a sudden nervousness and lack of decisiveness that contrasted sharply with the queen's former confidence. She was trapped in a cycle. Every action intended to secure her dominance was now shadowed by the ominous reflection of potential ruin. Her attempts to confront the mirrors themselves only amplified her fear. She approached them with caution, peering into each reflection to test the validity of the images. Yet every glance reinforced the same horrifying message. The more she plotted against the protagonist, the more certain her own downfall became. Her reflection would twist unnaturally, showing her face in expressions of shock, fear, and agony. Objects in the mirrors, tables, tapestries, or even the floor beneath her feet, would appear broken or overturned as if her own malice had caused the palace to rebel. These visions were vivid, visceral, and undeniable, leaving her no room to dismiss them as coincidence. Even the simplest tasks became sources of anxiety. A casual walk through the halls or a greeting to a courtier carried the weight of potential misfortune, for the mirrors seemed to shadow her every step, predicting errors and consequences she had not yet considered. Sleep offered no respite. Nightmares, vivid and echoing the mirror's warnings, haunted her dreams. She would see herself falling into pits, being confronted by those she had sought to manipulate, or suffering public humiliation in front of the very courtiers she wished to control. Each night, she awoke drenched in sweat, her heart pounding with the anticipation of disaster. The queen's panic grew compounded by the protagonist's serene composure. The young woman moved through the palace untroubled, aware of the queen's envy but never provoked into fear or rash action. This stark contrast only deepened the queen's anxiety. Her schemes, meant to destroy the protagonist, now seemed to tighten invisible bonds around herself. The palace, the court, and the mirrors all appeared aligned against her, amplifying every shadow of her fear. Even as she tried to seek counsel, none could truly guide her. Advisors, aware of her growing panic but unaware of the magical mirror's influence, suggested typical strategies, reassurances, minor distractions, or diplomatic gestures, but none addressed the root of the problem. The queen realized with a chilling clarity that her panic was born not merely of human opposition, but of forces she could neither bribe, threaten, nor control. By the time the sun dipped behind the palace spires each evening, the queen's once commanding presence had diminished to a nervous, restless figure. The mirrors reflected her inner turmoil with a clarity that left no doubt. Every act of envy, every plot against the protagonist, carried consequences beyond her imagination. Fear had taken root in her heart, a constant reminder that her schemes were failing and that her own ruin was imminent. The palace, the mirrors, and the young woman herself now seemed aligned in a quiet, unyielding warning. Malice against the just would not go unpunished. The palace held its breath as the queen prepared for her final, desperate attempt to replace the protagonist. Every intricate plan, every carefully timed maneuver, was set into motion with the expectation of triumph. She had gathered her allies, adjusted court ceremonies, and manipulated envoys, all in a bid to humiliate and displace the young woman. Her confidence, though shaken by previous failures and the ominous warnings of the mirrors, was bolstered by her belief that this final attempt would succeed. She envisioned a moment of undeniable dominance, where her rival would be exposed, diminished, and ultimately removed from favor. Yet, the mirrors, silent and ever watchful, were ready to reveal the truth of her malice in a way the court could not ignore. As the queen enacted her plan, subtle changes began to ripple through the air. Courtiers noticed a strange chill, a shifting of light within the hall, and the faint whisper of an unseen presence. The mirrors, strategically placed throughout the palace chambers and corridors, responded immediately to the queen's intent. Their reflective surfaces shimmered and shifted, no longer passive observers but active participants in unveiling the consequences of her envy. What she had intended as a private humiliation became a public spectacle as the mirrors began to reveal her own actions in stark clarity. The first mirror, positioned near the throne, reflected not the protagonist but the queen herself, caught in moments of fear, greed, and desperation. Her schemes appeared in vivid detail. Intercepted letters, manipulated courtiers, and magical charms all twisted back upon her image. Each reflection showed her vulnerable, her malice laid bare for anyone watching to perceive. The courtiers, who had gathered to witness the orchestrated humiliation, gasped as they saw their queen entwined in a narrative of her own undoing. Murmurs spread quickly, disbelief mixing with awe as the true nature of the queen's envy became impossible to deny. The mirrors continued their relentless revelation. Some displayed symbolic consequences, thrones collapsing, regal garments torn, and ceremonial objects overturned, all corresponding to the queen's plotted schemes. Others reflected the protagonist in her usual serene composure, untouched and dignified, highlighting the contrast between virtue and malice. The images were both literal and allegorical, teaching the court that cruelty, deceit, and envy could never triumph over integrity. With each reflection, the queen's intended humiliation transformed into a display of her own impending downfall, visible not only to her but to every witness in the grand hall. Even as the queen attempted to adjust her actions, to redirect blame or salvage her plan, the mirrors anticipated her moves. Every subtle shift, every gesture, every command was mirrored back with consequences magnified and unavoidable. Her allies, seeing the dramatic and unerring revelations, began to hesitate, their loyalty shaken by the stark visual proof of their queen's malice. The court was captivated, unable to look away, as the mirror's reflections forced a confrontation with truth that could not be ignored. The young woman, calm and observant, remained composed, aware that the unseen forces of the mirrors were ensuring justice without a single word spoken. The climax arrived when the queen, in a last attempt at direct confrontation, advanced toward the protagonist, expecting to assert her dominance. At that precise moment, the largest mirror in the hall reflected a scene that froze everyone in shock. The queen herself, collapsing under the weight of her schemes, surrounded by chaos and the very symbols she had used to manipulate others. The court saw her vulnerability, her fear, and the futility of her envy laid bare. The protagonist's dignity shone through the reflection, untouched by malice, a living testament to virtue and patience. The queen's final attempt, intended to remove her rival, had been thwarted completely, the mirrors ensuring that every consequence of malice was visible to all. In that instant, the queen's panic became complete. The realization that her own actions had been turned against her, magnified and revealed by forces beyond human control, left her speechless. The court, witnessing the truth unfold, began to murmur in approval and astonishment. Respect for the protagonist intensified, while fear and awe settled over the queen. The mirrors had not only exposed the queen's malice but had done so in a way that demanded acknowledgement from the entire palace. The final confrontation was over before a word of retaliation could be spoken. The mirrors had delivered justice, visible and undeniable, leaving the queen defeated in spirit and reputation. In the wake of the queen's final, thwarted attempt, the palace breathed a collective sigh, though the tension lingered in every gilded corridor. The young protagonist, having observed each of the queen's schemes with patience and quiet intelligence, now stood unshaken, her dignity intact and her favor with the court fully preserved. While the queen's envy had driven her to increasingly desperate measures, the girl's composure had remained unassailable. There was a certain calm radiance about her now, a presence that conveyed strength without aggression, and integrity without pride. Her restraint, her ability to endure malice without faltering, had not only protected her but had transformed her into a living symbol of virtue within the palace walls. The courtiers, having witnessed the dramatic revelations of the mirrors, could no longer entertain the false narratives spun by the queen. Her malice, once hidden beneath layers of subtlety and manipulation, was now exposed in its full magnitude. Every whisper, every intercepted letter, every attempt to undermine the protagonist had been reflected back upon the queen herself. The mirrors had shown that envy and cruelty, no matter how cleverly concealed, were visible to forces beyond human observation, and the court could see the truth in those reflections. Their admiration and trust, previously divided or cautious, now firmly rested with the young woman who had remained steadfast and composed throughout. The queen, in contrast, was left to confront the consequences of her own actions. Her schemes, laid bare, had not only failed but had reinforced her own vulnerability and exposed her cruelty. The courtiers, some formerly loyal or fearful, now viewed her with suspicion and a measure of dread. Her attempts at dominance had backfired, her reputation tarnished by the very manipulations meant to secure her power. Even her closest advisors, recognizing the futility of further support in the face of her exposed malice, began to distance themselves. The queen's authority, though still formally recognized, was undermined by the undeniable evidence of her envy and cruelty. Meanwhile, the protagonist's vindication extended beyond mere survival. Her reputation, bolstered by the calm and deliberate manner in which she navigated the queen's plots, became a cornerstone of respect within the palace. Nobles and courtiers alike observed her conduct, noting her intelligence, patience, and unwavering integrity. These qualities, which had been tested by envy and malice, had emerged strengthened, earning her both protection and admiration. She no longer needed to act aggressively to maintain her position. Her restraint, paired with the evident justice delivered by the mirrors, spoke louder than words or force ever could. The court began to recognize a broader lesson in the events that had unfolded. Malice, envy, and deceit, no matter how persistent or sophisticated, could never truly triumph over virtue. The protagonist, by maintaining her composure and allowing the forces of unseen justice to operate, demonstrated the power of patience and moral steadfastness. Her vindication was a testament not only to her personal qualities but also to the principle that fairness and integrity have a weight that surpasses cunning and cruelty. In the days that followed, the young woman's role in the palace was solidified. Her opinions were sought, her counsel respected, and her presence regarded as a stabilizing force in the court. Those who had once overlooked or underestimated her now recognized the depth of her character and the strength of her judgment. Even the queen's failed attempts, visible to all, had inadvertently elevated the protagonist, highlighting her as someone capable of navigating intrigue and adversity without compromising her principles. The queen, confronted with the full measure of her envy, could only watch as the young woman's integrity remained untouched. Each reflection in the mirrors served as a reminder that the protagonist's calm, dignified approach had not only shielded her from harm but had also ensured the exposure of malice. Her vindication was complete, safe, respected, and favored, while the queen's schemes lay bare for all to see. Thus, the protagonist stood at the center of the palace, unshaken and dignified. Her favor with the court unbroken, her reputation spotless, and her integrity intact, she exemplified the triumph of virtue over envy. The queen's malice, fully exposed and impotent, became a cautionary tale in its own right, reinforcing the enduring truth that cruelty and deceit, no matter how cunning, cannot overcome patience, wisdom, and moral fortitude. The palace, once a stage for subtle intrigues and whispered envy, now resonated with a new atmosphere of awe and cautious respect. The queen's repeated failures, culminating in the dramatic exposure of her malice by the mirrors, had left a deep impression on everyone who witnessed them. Courtiers, advisors, and attendants moved through the halls with a renewed sense of awareness, recognizing the protagonist not only as someone of exceptional character but also as a figure seemingly protected by forces beyond ordinary comprehension. The court's reaction was a mixture of relief, admiration, and quiet astonishment, as the young woman's patience, intelligence, and moral fortitude became undeniable truths etched into every conversation and glance. In the days following the queen's thwarted attempts, discussions throughout the palace shifted from trivial gossip to sincere acknowledgement of the protagonist's qualities. Nobles and courtiers spoke in hushed tones about her wisdom and composure, noting how she had remained unaffected by the queen's envy and schemes. They marveled at the calm resilience with which she navigated danger, observing that her dignity had never wavered. Some whispered that her protection might be mystical, the work of unseen forces guiding events to preserve justice and fairness. Others, more pragmatic in thought, attributed her success to sheer intelligence and restraint, recognizing that patience and moral clarity could outmaneuver even the most persistent malice. The young woman's presence became a symbol of steadiness within the palace. She moved through the corridors with quiet confidence, her demeanor untouched by the chaos that had consumed the queen. Those who had previously underestimated her now approached with caution and respect, mindful of both her wisdom and the subtle power that seemed to surround her. Her reputation spread beyond the immediate court. Envoys and visiting dignitaries, hearing of her calm triumph over envy and deceit, regarded her with curiosity and deference. In this way, the palace itself seemed to shift its balance of authority, with the protagonist's integrity serving as a stabilizing force amidst the echoes of the queen's failed schemes. The queen's presence, in contrast, became increasingly tenuous. Once the embodiment of power and influence, she now navigated the palace with an air of subdued tension, aware that her malice had been exposed to all. Courtiers who had once obeyed her unquestioningly now regarded her with caution, keenly aware that her envy and deceit had been revealed in the most dramatic fashion. The mirrors, reflecting her vulnerability and repeated failures, served as both a reminder and a warning. Her schemes were no longer private, and her authority could not command the respect it once had. The queen's attempts to reassert dominance were met with polite compliance at best, tinged with the silent acknowledgement of her diminished credibility. The protagonist, meanwhile, engaged with the court in ways that demonstrated both grace and prudence. She offered counsel when sought, intervened in disputes with careful judgment, and navigated courtly ceremonies with composed elegance. Her reputation for fairness and insight deepened, as those around her realized that her wisdom extended beyond personal survival. It influenced decision-making, conflict resolution, and the overall harmony of the palace. Even in moments of ceremonial grandeur, her presence carried an unspoken authority, one earned not through envy or coercion, but through the consistent demonstration of virtue and foresight. Whispers of mysterious protection persisted among the courtiers. Some spoke quietly of the mirrors as agents of justice, ensuring that the queen's malice could not succeed. Others suggested that the young woman herself carried an innate power, a force of destiny that safeguarded the just and patient. These discussions, while veiled in secrecy, only enhanced the aura surrounding her, reinforcing both fear and admiration in those who interacted with her daily. The palace, once dominated by the unpredictable influence of envy and intrigue, now recognized a different order, one rooted in the integrity and foresight embodied by the protagonist. Over time, the court's acknowledgement solidified into lasting respect. The young woman's triumph over adversity, her careful observation of the queen's schemes, and the subtle yet unmistakable intervention of unseen forces became the stories that guided behavior within the palace. Nobles and attendants learned to navigate courtly life with honesty and prudence, aware that deceit and envy, however cleverly concealed, could bring unforeseen consequences. The protagonist's wisdom and virtue were remembered as a guiding standard. Her calm authority contrasted sharply with the queen's exposed malice, ensuring that her legacy would endure within the palace for generations. In this transformed court, justice, patience, and integrity were celebrated, while envy and cruelty were recognized as dangers that ultimately self-destruct. The protagonist's victory was not only personal but emblematic, teaching all who witnessed it that virtue, combined with awareness and restraint, could prevail against even the most determined malice. The palace, once a theater of subtle schemes, had been reshaped into a place where moral clarity and careful judgment held sway, thanks to the young woman who had remained steadfast, observant, and protected in the face of relentless envy. Years passed, and the tale of the young woman and the queen became woven into the fabric of the kingdom's history, spoken of in whispers, songs, and lessons passed from one generation to the next. It was remembered not merely as a story of palace intrigue, but as a profound lesson on the consequences of envy, the endurance of virtue, and the unseen forces that protect the innocent. Mothers would tell their children of the queen whose malice could not prevail, and of the young woman whose patience and integrity had been shielded by forces beyond mortal comprehension. The mirrors, silent yet ever-present, became symbols of justice and moral clarity, reminders that cruelty and deceit inevitably carry consequences. In the years following the dramatic events, the palace itself seemed to honor the memory of the young woman's triumph. The mirrors that had reflected the queen's envy and revealed the truth were maintained and revered, placed strategically in halls and chambers as both aesthetic objects and symbols of moral vigilance. Courtiers, both new and experienced, learned to approach them with respect, understanding that they represented more than reflective surfaces. They embodied accountability, observation, and the subtle enforcement of justice. Visitors from distant lands, upon seeing these mirrors, often remarked on their legendary history, astonished at the idea that inanimate objects had played such a decisive role in shaping the fate of the kingdom. Stories of the young woman's virtue spread far beyond the walls of the palace. Scholars recorded accounts of her calm intelligence, her careful observation, and her unwavering dignity in the face of envy. The kingdom came to recognize that the true power of the protagonist lay not in force or status, but in her ability to act with restraint, patience, and moral clarity. Her story became a standard by which character and leadership were measured, a beacon of guidance for those who sought to navigate both courtly life and the broader social order. People spoke of her as someone whose integrity had altered the very course of events, a figure whose influence extended long after the immediate dangers had passed. The legacy of the mirrors was particularly significant. They became intertwined with cultural understanding of justice and consequence. Young apprentices were taught that deceit, malice, and envy, no matter how cleverly disguised, would always encounter resistance, whether through the intervention of unseen forces, the vigilance of virtue, or the natural consequences of human action. In schools and homes alike, the mirror's story served as both warning and inspiration. Cruelty against the innocent would not go unnoticed, and patience combined with moral clarity could overcome even the most determined plots. The reflective surfaces, once mere tools of observation, had been transformed into timeless symbols of accountability and the protection of the just. The queen's downfall, conversely, became a cautionary tale. Her envy and malice were cited repeatedly as examples of the perils of selfish ambition, a demonstration of how personal desire unchecked by conscience can lead to public humiliation and lasting disgrace. Court historians and storytellers emphasized that her repeated failures were not merely chance but the inevitable result of her moral choices, amplified and exposed by the mirror's unique capacity to reveal truth. The young woman, by contrast, remained the embodiment of resilience, virtue, and quiet power, someone who triumphed not through aggression but through steadfast adherence to principle. Over generations, the story inspired countless individuals within the kingdom. Leaders sought to emulate her wisdom and composure, parents encouraged their children to act with patience and honesty, and citizens came to understand that moral integrity could, in its own quiet way, command respect and influence outcomes in ways that force or cunning could never achieve. The mirrors themselves, once objects of curiosity, became revered as emblems of the unseen forces that intervene in favor of justice. They reminded all who gazed into them that virtue is never without support, that moral clarity has weight, and that envy and cruelty ultimately carry their own burdens. Thus the young woman's story endured. The kingdom remembered not only her triumph over the queen but also the broader lessons it imparted. That envy leads to ruin, that integrity and patience hold immense power, and that unseen forces, whether magical or symbolic, work in favor of the just. The mirror's legacy became inseparable from hers, ensuring that generations would continue to learn from the tale, respecting justice and recognizing the quiet strength of those who act with honesty and virtue. In this way, the memory of the young woman, the queen's failure, and the mirror's revelations became a permanent, guiding influence in the kingdom, a moral compass for all who came after.